I am Dr. Willett. If you've been to our webinars before, I might look a little bit familiar. If you've gone to our YouTube channel before, then I probably look a little bit familiar as introducing all of our webinar series before as well. Welcome. Today we are joined by Dr. Hernandez, and I will introduce her in just a second. And we're talking about using Zoom and how all of our lives have changed in the time of coronavirus. So let me introduce Dr. Hernandez to you so you kind of have an idea of who that you are listening to for the day. So this year, Dr. Hernandez joined the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences Applied Academic Programs here at Johns Hopkins University as our program coordinator for the MA in Communication. She came from Marian University, where she developed a digital media studies track and served as the advisor for student newspaper and co-director for the honors program. Dr. Hernandez, like many of all of you and me, was forced to transition our work online, and yes, she has utilized Zoom. Hernandez has extensive experience in on-ground and online course and program development, and she's developed an online MS degree in communication. Hernandez also served as a vice president of character education at an international social movement and nonprofit named Because I Said I Would, where she led strategic communication and program development and implementation, which has appeared on NBC's TODAY Show. In all of her roles, she's no stranger to strategically and effectively working remotely with students, colleagues, clients, and CEOs alike. Her work appears in the Journal of Communication Education, Journal of Media Psychology, Journal of Psycho-Oncology, and the Handbook of Arab American Psychology. She has served as a consultant role for the CDC, small businesses, and higher education institutions. She was awarded a PRSA Silver Anvil Award and for an internship partnership program with the city of Riverside. Hernandez received her PhD in journalism and mass communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she also earned her MS in life sciences. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Hernandez. Have a great time, everyone. I'll see you at the end for the Q&A.
Like many of you, you're happily sitting at your desk and then you realize you have a Zoom meeting. So you get up, you go, put on your jacket. Pro tip, always wear a solid color shirt. That way any jacket you grab will match. And of course, always wear pants. You close the blinds, you adjust the lighting, sit down, you find where your music tab is, because certainly it's open and you have 20 other tabs, and you prepare for your call.
I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Would you be my neighbor? Won't you please?
Won't you please? And thank you for joining my Zoom room.
So now you're in my Zoom room, which you can't see all of what you saw, but that's where I live. And you can see that literally the bed is right next to where I'm sitting. When I moved here, I wasn't planning on being remote, probably like many of you. So the reason I did this video was because that's literally how I feel. Like I'll be on my computer and it's not as smooth as that. The music is not as nice and lovely. My apartment's not that clean usually. The lighting's not that great, but that's how I feel. Like I have to, shut the tabs, close the curtains, go get my jacket. So I felt like it reminded me of Mr. Rogers. And so I thought it'd be a nice little spoof to do. But if any of you want to create a TikTok, I promise you don't have to give me credit. So you can do that and make it better. This is going to be a little bit different than most webinars. So what I want to do is take you through a journey, and it's kind of my journey, but also my students' journey and just the journey of things that I've done remotely, both remotely and in person. And so it begins with the screenshot that you see on the left here. So it's, look, you submitted an application to Johns Hopkins University, October 29th, 9:41 a.m. Clearly the world was a different place back then. And here I am now in DC. So I'm gonna kind of take you on a little journey. So what we're gonna talk about is my transition from fully in-person teaching to fully online, how we thrived. When I say we, I mean my students and I. And then is zoomed out a real thing? And then finally, just best communication practices, which is what you're all here for. And actually, quite frankly, I question some of your sanity for, if you're zoomed out, why are you here? But hopefully I'll make it worth your time. And like any good presentation, you save the best for last, so you stay on. So that's kind of the overview. All right, so we're going to begin with a poll. So how zoomed out, or are you zoomed out? Not how zoomed out are you? Are you zoomed out? Okay, so 74% of you are zoomed out, and understandably so. I would be remiss to say that I am not either. I remember having a conversation with a advisee, a student advisee, of course, is all online now. And I told him that I was going to boycott all video conferencing after this was over. And so that's kind of why I got into the description of what the webinar was all about. But I unfortunately don't think that will be our reality, but that's kind of where I'm at now. So this is my POV. So from my point of view, as you can see, the date was March 8th, 2020. I was on an airplane. It was spring break. Again, I was teaching at another institution. It was spring break. Where was I headed? Was I headed off to the beach? No, I was headed to Washington, D.C. to find a place to live. So you can tell the seats were pretty empty. Pandemic was pretty alive and well here in the United States, but things hadn't shut down yet. Didn't even have to wear a mask. Obviously in March, early March, masks weren't mandated. So there weren't many people on the flight. So I flew to DC, excited to find a place to live. And I scored a great place to live, literally right next to the DC campus. It's a place that Bob Woodward actually lived when he communicated with Deep Throat. So just a fun little side fact. But I actually had lunch with Dr. Han on the Wednesday that I flew back, and basically the world shut down Friday. So I had signed my lease. But you know what? It was kind of nice. Like, oh, I'm just getting back from spring break and I get another week because like most universities and offices and things, they said, all right, well, we're gonna close down for 2 weeks. And so it was kind of nice. Like I'm in Wisconsin, living on the lake, great sunsets, not a bad thing. Get extra spring break week. But then as you all know, it was another week and another week. And if you're in Wisconsin, that's what your spring break looks like. So it snows. So we're at the end of March, and we've decided that, okay, we have to transition to being online because we cannot be in person anymore. And so what do? You're teaching fully on ground. You're going to your office every single day. You're managing people from your office. And then all of a sudden you're told you can't go back to your office. You can't go get your blazers that you left in your office, like Dr. Willett. You can't go back and get maybe the leftover lunch that you were craving. So you're forced to do something, to act. And there wasn't an instruction manual. No company that I know of had a crisis management plan that included a pandemic, not even the United States, which that's a whole nother story. But there just wasn't a manual. So I had to show this picture because I looked back through like all my photos and I've just like been capturing things over time. And this was a colleague who I was on a committee for something. And in the message, you can see he wasn't sure how to send a Zoom invite yet. And this is not to make fun of him, but some people never, ever, open Zoom in their life, never turned on their camera in their computer in their life, and haven't done any of these things that we have to do. So although there wasn't an instruction manual, if you're a professor or a teacher, you have these things that are called, syllabi. And so on there, it has, exactly what you're gonna be doing throughout the semester, but it doesn't tell you, really necessarily the modality. And so I thought I was a genius because usually in my syllabi, I usually put like a 2-week, like this is like flex time, because I usually don't follow the syllabus in general, just because, you go over time on certain things. So I thought I was a genius, but I prepared for snow days, etc. But again, not for a pandemic. And so my first thought was that the students not paid, well, they did pay, but the students chose to go to school in person, not online. And this is this particular setting. So I'm like, what can I do to make it the most like in person as possible? And so my immediate thought was, okay, we're going to do live synchronous sessions via the web. We're going to do them on the exact same days that a class are, the exact same times. So I remember sending out an email to my students. And now keep in mind, in this email, I didn't say you have to have your camera on, you have to attend, attendance is mandatory. I didn't give really any instructions. I think I sent the Zoom link. I'm sure I sent the Zoom link. And then what I told them, and again, still wasn't like we're done for the rest of the semester. But I said, this is one of my favorite quotes it's the Option B book, which was written by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant. And I still don't know who to attribute this exact quote to, but it's like, when you can't have option A, you take the shit out of option B. And so that's literally what I told my students, and apologize about swearing, but that's literally what I told them. And that's still how I feel. So this is option B. So we're synchronous, we're online. This is another screenshot. Obviously, it was a lot more messy than my desk now, but there's something else that's is in my manual that I like to call it. In every semester, I have it in my syllabus. You can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up. And my philosophy in teaching is just come to class. Of course, this is in person. Even if you didn't do the readings, I'm not going to kick you out of class. And maybe that's not your philosophy, or wasn't your teacher's philosophy in the past, but that's my philosophy. Just show up, because I genuinely care if you're there, to the point where if a student doesn't show up, I would send an email. I don't care where they are, just making sure you're okay. And students learn that I cared. So I think that started this setup for success for transitioning online, because students showed up in general in class. But as you can see from the picture, that the screen is full. All the students have their camera on but one. And they showed up at 2 days a week. Both classes were an hour. The classes are an hour and 15 minutes each. I had 3 different classes, and people showed up and they were engaged. So things were going great. And then one day, no technology issues, nothing. We're at the end of the semester, so this is beginning of May. All of a sudden, we're doing this project. It was a TikTok assignment, and the students had to create a TikTok, which, trust me, there was other learning objectives prior to that final part of the project. And so the students sent me the links to their TikToks, and I shared my screen and we watched them. But then one student said that he couldn't get the link, so he asked to share his screen, which I didn't even think twice about, because I've done that in my classes before. I trust my students. I've never had an issue. All of a sudden, I see my screen on the right-hand side, and it just keeps saying reconnecting. And I'm like, hey, hello, is anyone there? And I'm kind of like, shoot, what do I do? My mentality is like, the show must go on. So I quickly ended the meeting and then sent a new link to the students via email. So I went back on, and 2 students were on, and they were smiling. And I'm like, what happened? And they're like, oh shoot, maybe we rejoined too early. So the students played a prank on me. And as you can see, one of the students spelled reconnecting incorrectly. So they played a prank on me. And I actually thought it was funny. And we laughed for a few minutes, and then we got right back to what we were doing before. The class went overtime. All the students stayed because it was actually their fault. But it was this very lighthearted, just kind of fun little end of the semester thing that happened. So what did I do? I wasn't mad about it at all. I tweeted about it. And I called this class my dream team, because it was a class that I had started teaching. Basically, this class had most of the students that I had the first year I was teaching at this institution. So I tweeted about it, and then the Wall Street Journal contacted me a little while later to do an interview about this prank. And so I was excited, Wall Street Journal, it's great. So in the interview, it's a 45-minute interview. I talked about, how it happened, gave the name of the person in charge of the prank. But I think she was trying to get out of me of how disruptive it was and et cetera. But for me, that's not how I looked at it. I thought my students, they trust me enough to have this very lighthearted, completely unharmful thing happen. But I could definitely see where this could be very disruptive, and people could be offended by it. But again, that's not my philosophy. So she does the interview, and then the article comes out, and it didn't touch upon any of the things that I said, but of course, it's trying to fit it into the story. But the point is, we were able to have fun with this activity. Again, this is all online. And then the last example that I'll share is we had this award show. So this is my public relations writing class. So in the class, at the end of the class, the students write an introduction for another student, and then that student does his or her presentation. And so, of course, I didn't want them to do another, video recording presentation. So we came up with this idea that students would pick a student in the class, and then they would decide an award that student would get. And then they would have to write why, what the award is, why the student got it. And then they have to present it. So practice their, public speaking skills too. And somehow we turned it into this idea of an award show. And there was a lot of planning that went into it. So the student picked a student of the award, wrote it. But then we also had walk-up music. So each student told me their favorite song. So I would have the walk-up music for when they got the award. And then the nice touch, which if you teach at a small institution, you teach several students over again. I played one of their projects when they got their, after they got their award, to showcase something that they've done in class. So whether it was a news broadcast, a social media press release, a video they actually created. And then we had an MC too. One of the students volunteered to be the MC, did an opening act and everything. And this was the last day of class for this particular class. And we had a blast. You can see from all their faces, some of them dressed up, they have the virtual backgrounds, and it was just fun. And it was kind of an emotional day because it was, the last class with these students, but just to say you can make the best of option B. And not every one of my classes were, this exciting. I like to think so, but I think what you put into it is what you get out of it. And so some of the reasons why I think we thrived. Actually, one little side note. One day, I was teaching a regular, not Zoomies or TikTok class, but someone that was in the place I was staying asked me, "Are you teaching or are you having fun?" And I was like, both. You can do both. And of course, if you're not a teacher, this also applies to other meetings too. And not every meeting is going to be fun and you have to make an event of it. But I think some of these principles can be translated to not school, obviously. And these aren't the best practices. These are what I'm saying worked throughout that transition. So we did it synchronous. And I'm not saying that asynchronous can't work. I'm 100% a believer in that. I teach that. Now. So the cameras were on. And again, I don't think that has to be the case. Research shows that doesn't mean you're less engaged if your camera's not on. There's other things that are, go into play for success. And actually, as a side note, every one of my students had access to the technology and internet and everything. So I also understand there's a lot of other, challenges that people face that you wouldn't be able to do these things. So I just want to acknowledge that. We had good attendance, but again, I think it was because of what we were doing in person that led to that, attendance. We talked about the pandemic. So I would ask the students just, how are you doing? As students, we talked about, current events, which I did in class anyways. One of the things that students really enjoyed was we had a theme once a week. So one week it was we introduce your pet. One week it was show your favorite baseball cap. One week it was introduce someone from your house. And they all came up with those ideas. I didn't come up with them. And again, that was something that was, super easy, lighthearted. Yes, did it take up class time? But I really do think it helped with just, that cohesiveness and trying to thrive during a pandemic. And then Kahoots, if you're not familiar with that, they're games that students love. Polls, just engagement. How do you get people engaged? So whether you're in a virtual classroom or a virtual meeting, whether you're in a boardroom, how do you get people in that meeting engaged? Because we've all been in webinars, in meetings. Trust me, I am 100% there where I haven't had my camera off because I'm doing other things, which is not every meeting is the most important. But how do you get people, to be engaged? Had group-led presentations. So students had group presentations that they were doing in class. And just because we were forced online, they didn't get out of their group project. They still had to do their group presentations. They did a fantastic job. And again, the technology worked. And this is something that is super controversial. I remember reading an article in the Chronicles of Higher Ed right when this pandemic started about what you should wear. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, don't, you know, wear pajama pants or just dress casual. And you know what, you do you. Like, I'm not saying there is one right way, but like for me, it's just like my own personal brand. I literally got to put the same thing I would as I was going to class, still curled my hair, put earrings on. I would even put perfume on just because I was in the habit of doing that. But again, I wanted to make things as, you know, as close in person as possible. So that's how I feel like we thrived. But let's transition. So I felt like it was flawless. I hope my students did too. I wouldn't say they thought it was flawless, but from a teaching standpoint. So I think I did a really good job with my students in the classroom, but that doesn't mean that my students weren't experiencing other challenges or difficulties, or that I wasn't either. But from a faculty standpoint, I thought it went well. And so I had to ask myself, like, why did it go so well? And it didn't occur to me until like I actually spent some time thinking about it. It was because I've worked remotely before. And you can see from the title, it says optional by choice, which is kind of redundant, but it's true, remote work. So I took my first faculty job actually teaching online and hybrid courses, and I developed an online master's degree in communication. And then I also worked 3 years for a nonprofit as vice president of character education. And of those 3 years, 2 of them were completely remote. So I would go to headquarters once in a while too. So I wasn't a stranger to any of the best practices or tactics for online, whether it be teaching or working remotely, having one-on-one meetings, you know, with the CEO, having team meetings from afar. So it was just like my second nature. But again, I didn't really even think about it because again, it's just like riding a bike. You just get on your bike, you don't think about how you do it. So we'll talk about what I learned throughout those experiences. And again, this will apply to things that are also outside the classroom. So back because I said I would, we didn't use Zoom, we used Google Hangouts, which now I think it's called something else. So, but we would always use video. So every time, so the CEO, he traveled over 360, or not 360, that's how many days in a year. He traveled a lot. So many of the meetings were via Google Hangout, even when I wasn't at HQ headquarters. So we always were using video calls. Every team meeting, it would just be me. I would be the only one on the video. Everyone else would be, you know, at headquarters. So I'm going to talk about the best virtual meeting practices, best communication practices. And the third one, I'm not going to actually talk about, but I want to mention because it was a huge lesson that I learned, is just that autonomy is bliss. And I think that would be for like another session for maybe like managers or something, as where we know that people need more flexibility, especially during these hard times. Check the time. Okay, so before we do that, let's go to poll number 2. So to what extent are you working remotely currently? So always, sometimes, or never. Okay. All right, so 44% of you are always working remote, 8 sometimes, and 1% never. Or I should say working or going to school remotely. And just out of curiosity, oh, I should share the, well, you can see that I'm sharing that screen. Out of curiosity, I don't know if we can open the Q&A, Tasha, but for those of you that are sometimes, only sometimes working remotely, is that by choice or because you have to sometimes go in person? Okay, yeah, so some people's offices just aren't open. Okay, so this was a Gallup poll from 2020. So the frequency of remote working in response to COVID-19. So the question was, to what extent are you working remotely to avoid catching or spreading the coronavirus? So you can see back in April, 51% said always, whereas now 33% said always. You know, things are a lot different now than they were in April. Some places are starting to open up. But again, I want to touch back on this point of, I understand that people don't always have a choice. First of all, so many people lost their jobs, so many people lost their lives, that it's, you know, we don't have a choice. And so I just wanted to, again, acknowledge that. And I think that's really important. But I also want to acknowledge too that throughout this pandemic, some people are like, oh, just be happy you have a job, which is true. But what's not true about that statement is the just part. Because there are just so many other factors in our lives aside from who we are at work and the job that we do. Many of you are juggling so many other things, family, kids, teaching your kids, moving houses, moving your parents' house, taking care of loved ones. And there's just so many other aspects aside of who you are from your job. And I think that was something when I was going through this presentation that is not on a slide per se, but just this idea of, humanity and the interpersonal communication that we normally have when we're in our office setting doesn't happen as often now because we're on Zoom. And so just acknowledging that, everybody has a story and just trying to keep that human aspect. So post-COVID, so I know some of you, if you're like me, you're like, cannot wait to get back to my office. First of all, I moved during a pandemic. Can't wait to meet my colleagues in person. So post-pandemic, what is your preference? So I think the options are return, work remotely, or hybrid. Nobody wants to retire? We must have people that either love their jobs or maybe can't afford to retire. I don't know, but I'm surprised no one wants to retire. 74% said hybrid, 20% work remotely, and then 6% said return to the office. So in general, this kind of goes back to back in the old days, online, learning was such a faux pas of like, oh, you can't really do the same thing that you do in, online, or you think of, some of the for-profit online institutions where you can buy your degree. But as we've seen, because of the pandemic, things can be done, just as good online and sometimes better than in person. But everyone has a preference. And so I think at the end of the day, it's always been what's best. And I think the answer, even based on research, is hybrid. So, but again, it's having that option. Right now, some of us don't have that option. And I think that's the important part, which is why I said optional by choice. I've gotten to do it in the past. So again, according to the Gallup poll, so people would like to return to working to the office. So about 36%. Most people also, prefer to work remotely. And then the number one concern, of course, is about COVID. So I think, it'll be interesting to see what happens, but the point is that Zoom is not going anywhere anytime soon. And so how do we effectively communicate utilizing Zoom, which is what you all came here for? So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. Of course, I know my comm folks are. So computer mediated communication. What is that? That sounds, first of all, it sounds kind of old because it's computer, but basically this term has been around since the 80s. So basically communication, exchanging of information, but it's not just a computer. So the name, could be updated. We could say electronic mediated communication. So think text messages, think emails, intranets, chats, etc. But also Zoom is computer mediated communication. And now we're using the term Zoom like we do if we're going to get a Kleenex, because not everyone's using Zoom. Some of you are using WebEx, some of you are using Google Hangouts, some of you are using Skype, some of you are using FaceTime. I don't know what you're using, but the point is this virtual interaction that we're having. And that's another important term. Is like, what do you use? Are we distant? Well, yes, we're distant. I'm close to your screen. I can't see any of you all. So the challenge is not computer mediated communication, because that's been around for a while. Remember when we used to think that, well, I shouldn't say we, but as the generations go on, we say that younger people don't have that ability to communicate face to face because they're always on their phone texting, and they don't know how to have an interpersonal conversation because computer mediated. Now again, that's most of our only option. So is being zoomed out, and you can think of zoomed out as just not paying attention. That's one thing, but I'm talking about like physically like exhausted from Zoom. So it's a thing. So we all learned how to communicate, how to talk, the body language that we used via watching people do that. We heard voices, from one time we were born, and so we learned how to communicate in that way. Now, some of you can say, well, when my kids were young, like they're FaceTiming, so yeah, they understand that. But again, they have that human interaction connection, even if you're in the same house as somebody, but they're in a different room, that still feels different than when you're in this interaction that we're having now. So yeah, it's just not the way we're used to communicating. And there's this idea of spatial shifts. So between the physical and the virtual world, like right now, there's probably there is a lag between what I'm actually doing and saying. And you can only see a certain part of my body. If I'm doing hand movements down here, you can't see them, but obviously if I'm up here, there's just certain things that you can't see. There's certain lags. And again, of course, there's always disruptions or other things going on. And so it's this idea of we're trying to restore this synchronous interactions that we have in person, but it's just physically not possible to do in this virtual space. And so, yes, like it zoomed out is a thing. And I promise you, from my perspective, it is harder. It is so much harder to always be on Zoom or on a webinar, even if the work isn't physically exhausting. It's emotional labor, and especially when you're in a large meeting. So, for instance, you're in a large meeting. Everyone, you're expected to have your camera on, but everyone's doesn't have to engage, and you're thinking about them, a million other things you have to do. So it's just harder to be on the camera than in person. But some of you maybe think the other way around, just like online disclosure. Some people disclose more personal, personal things when they're, in an online chat or discussion than they would in person, and vice versa. So, last poll: the most frustrating aspect of Zoom meetings or classes. Okay, so looks like the highest percentage was lack of engagement from the group, followed by technology issues. And so just kind of think about this in your mind, the lack of engagement from the group. Is that something that you experienced when you were in person? I'm just purely curious. Did you experience that in person, or is it just more online? And then technology issues, yes, it's so frustrating. Even yesterday I grabbed another camera because my one camera hasn't been working and the Mac camera is horrible. So I grabbed one, tested it, it worked. Today, it wasn't working. I was like slightly freaking out. Anyways, always restart your computer. It started working. But then I went to curl my hair and my curling hair wasn't working. Thankfully, I had a second one. But yeah, technology issues are super frustrating. But it takes me back to, again, just having access to technology, but just internet speed and everything. And that will be a big part of one of my main points that I have today. But yeah, it is frustrating. And what can you do about it to make it less frustrating? Okay, so the best virtual meeting practices. And again, when I was putting this together, I was thinking about one of my students. He would always say, for some classes, he's like, literally you could just emailed me, the presentation, and would have been the exact same thing if I was, sitting there. And so hopefully that's not the case for this. If I just wanted to give you these best practices, I literally would have just had someone email them out, or you could just go Google best practices for, online meetings, etc. But again, this is based on my experience. This list is not exhaustive. So what you get into it, or what you put into it, is what you get out of it, whether you're the one preparing the meeting or, again, attending the meeting. So some of you had mentioned previously that lack of engagement. And so that's why when I say we thrived, because if it was just me being super engaged in the class and my students weren't, it would not have been the same experience. So think about that, even if you're an attendee. And I too need to think about that. How can you make that meeting or webinar a better experience for everyone? And this goes back to what I was about to say with the technology. I think we all need to just stop apologizing. stop apologizing for your poor lighting, your crappy camera, the noise in the background, not being able to share the screen, or yes, all of those things help make the meeting flow better and things, but we are all living in this together, and we just need to be patient. So just don't apologize. Thank people for their patience. It's all about framing. So if you're a person, it's how you frame things that make a big difference. Dress for success, but whatever that looks like for you. What for me works is not gonna be what works for you. And of course, if your company has policies, you wanna follow the policies. But we're so far into this now, you probably already have your routine, but there isn't one right way, but of course you have to follow policies. And we've seen so many blunders with people not having pants on. I just for the sake of it, I don't understand why you wouldn't wear shorts, pants, or anything, like something other than just underwear, because we've seen so many blunders. But have your video on, but not always. The research shows that students doesn't necessarily mean they're not as engaged. And of course, that is one sign of engagement, but honestly, how many times were you in a meeting in person where you weren't paying attention, or you were, but you're doing other things, taking notes, you can still pay attention. So again, if your company has policy about your camera, have it on, but again, it depends. This is the best one. Always send a calendar invite for any meeting. And if you're the one receiving it, either accept it or reject it if you have that luxury. Just knowing when these are, having them scheduled on your calendar. I get the 15-minute reminders, and that's just crucial and it's a way of communicating. So by you accepting it, you don't have to send these emails back and forth, which takes forever. So for meetings, like I have a lot of advisees, and so I'll send them an email and say, please let me know a few days and times that work for you, and then I will follow up with a calendar invite. I'm not going to follow up with another email. I'm just going to send a calendar invite. So again, those are for one-on-one meetings. And then finally, schedule in optional times. So some of us, we're alone all the time. So when we have these meetings, it's actually exciting. You get to talk to people, but there's some people that are in meetings all day long, and the last thing they want to do is another meeting or have small talk. So scheduling time for optional small talk, like some conferences, they'll do like an optional breakfast, and then the meeting starts at 9, optional breakfast at 8:30. So have that like optional time for the people that do and want to thrive on that, small talk, if you will, or powerful conversations. I don't want to diminish them, but have that scheduled in somewhere. That way, again, you're keeping the people engaged throughout the time that you need them. And then there's a different type of engagement when you have these optional sessions. And then facial expressions matter. I can't see any of your faces right now, but they matter. Even mine, you can see it matters whether I'm, tilting my head, smiling, or like, oh, like, wow, that's something interesting that you said. So keep that in mind when your camera is on, because even from the presenter's point of view, if I could see your faces, like that's a cue to me of like, oh, wait, or maybe that person can't hear me, or what I just said was really offensive. But yeah, your facial expressions matter, your posture, where your camera is. And I could go into all of these technical things, but this just helps with going back to that interpersonal communication of, that eye contact. You always make eye contact with someone. But again, it'd be weird if you and I were just like staring at each other like this when we were in person. So it's just a different type of eye contact. And then do something that I'm not doing right now, and I can tell, is speak slower, but I don't ever do that even in person. So make sure you do speak slower. And then that mute button, that powerful mute button, because when you're talking and then you stop, you can just hit mute, and that's a great social cue of, okay, I'm done saying what I need to. And then also it's good to have your mute on so you're not distracting other people, because they're like, my chair makes noises, so that would be distracting if I wasn't the one talking. And then ask for clarification. So making sure that you actually understand what is being said and not just hearing. And then this one is one I learned because I said I would. So have a hard stop. So whether you're having a one-on-one meeting or you're in a large group meeting, and again, kind of this goes back to like luxury and your position and where you stand. But if the meeting is scheduled from 3 to 4, you're committing that time, if you've accepted it or you plan the meeting, that this meeting is going to go from 3 to 4. And that's just kind of like you're accepting the contract. So if it's 4 o'clock or close to, you can say, sorry, I have a hard stop. Of course, if it's something important, you can ask the person, do you have extra time? Or, we can reschedule. But that hard stop, you don't have to have a reason, unless, of course, again, depends on the context, what you're discussing, but you don't have to like have something else scheduled another meeting. Maybe it's you told your kids that you were going to do something with them at 3:30, but again, it's your space, your time. And so have that hard stop, and that it's not rude. Like, you have other things, and even if it's another meeting with a student, or if you need that 20 minutes to prep for the meeting that you have, that's not until a half hour. So you're still honest, like I have a hard stop, I need to end this meeting, can we reschedule? Or if you're the person that scheduled the meeting, ask politely if it's okay if you go over time. So again, having that hard stop and being able to communicate that, and again, kind of being unapologetic about it. And just finally, it's just interpersonal communication. Again, acknowledging your coworkers, your students, your boss, just as humans that are all trying to navigate this way of life. And then the last, oh, sorry, I lied. There's 2 more polls, but they're quick ones. So how frequently did you attend meetings in person? And then how frequently did you dread meetings in person? Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. I'll share the results. All right, so 27% said always, or sorry, 66% said always, 34% sometimes for meetings. And then for dreading the meetings, sometimes was 59% and always was 22%. So I just kind of wanted to do that poll for fun, because we sometimes, maybe a lot, complain about these Zoom meetings, but I was honestly, it's kind of similar to, as in person, that, we don't always love to be in meetings, and we don't want to be meetinged or Zoomed out. So with that, this was my flight when I actually came here. So just different version. I did have my mask on. I took it off for the picture, and hand sanitizers. So that brings me back to that quote about option A or B. The beginning of the semester, I was really hoping to be in person, especially because I'm, paying the DuPont Circle rent to live close to campus. But I was fortunately I'm able to record lectures in the classroom, which is super nice. It just, even though no one's in there, it just feels kind of like playing on your home court. But then I read this article about how difficult it has been for the people that have gone back in the classroom just to read verbal cues. You can't do like the small group activities. And so I was at peace with this idea of, being completely online. So sometimes option B just may be better than option A. And then I'll leave you with my Angelo quote. My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style. And so I will open it up if anyone has any questions.
Okay, hello again. So we have a few comments throughout the day, and then we hopefully will grab some questions. So if you have questions that you would like to type in, now would be a great time for them. And then we can get them as they come in. So when you had the long list of different types of things that we hate in Zoom meetings, Kiana said, I wish we could pick more than one, and then laughed. And then Kathy said, another option for the poll, I wish there was more time to transition between Zooms. I think this was the 4th poll. It's hard to go back to back to back with no time in between. Yeah. It'd be nice if we had maybe 45-minute events, so that way you could get like 15 minutes, I think is what she meant. Kathy, you can tell me if I'm wrong. And then I'm so sorry, I might murder this name, and if I do, I really, really apologize. Davidra, there might not be an extra on that R, but how do we encourage for videos to be on?
So I think you can even use examples of just like engagement, and think of it from like a team aspect of, we're all in this together. This, by having your video on, it helps us all become more engaged, and develop this, if you don't already have, a close relationship, but just develop a more effective way to communicate. But again, I also want to make sure, I do understand that there are reasons why some people don't have their video on. So I think having that maybe separate conversation with those people ahead of time to make sure, but I think coming from a collaborative standpoint and just framing it as this is, a more effective way to communicate and be engaged.
Great, thank you. We're starting to get questions now rolling in. Keep them coming, guys. We'll get them as they come. We're often told about great ways to engage with students, fun icebreakers, trivia, etc. But so many of our students are saying that these are overused. How do we keep things fun without overuse of these different approaches? This is coming from Catherine.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I used to, I still kind of hate icebreakers. And so I asking the students for ideas. So I would mix mine up. I don't know if you've ever, Kahoot, I don't know why, students never get tired of that. And I think it's that competitive nature. And you don't always have to have an icebreaker, right? What's the point of an icebreaker? To get people mingling and stuff. So if these are regular occurrences, icebreakers don't make sense for every time. And so I think, asking for their advice of, okay, if you're tired of these icebreakers, what are your thoughts and ideas? So getting their input. But I again, keep going back to the point of what is the point of this icebreaker?
Yeah, I use Kahoot as well, and my students love it. So it's that competitive nature that always comes out.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, like you said, the quick Q&A at the beginning of and my cat just walked away, but show us your pet, or, something silly. Deborah asked, some of our peer offices have set aside no meeting days entirely for remote staff. I'm not sure if that's a question, but do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we have those too here at Hopkins, and funny how it works. There's webinars on that day, there's meetings on that day, on those days. Yeah, I think it really is important, but I also think it's important to adhere to that. But I remember when Mary and the interim president said there's no meetings on whatever this day, that's the day of my class. You're not taking my time away. So I think they are important, but I think making sure everyone's on the same page about it within your organization is also important.
Yeah, I agree. Natalie says, a lot of tips on making things better included nonverbal cues. Do you have any tips with encouraging through verbal communication or otherwise? The group I lead is mostly those who are autistic, and I am autistic myself, and sometimes nonverbal cues you included we try, but can be missed.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was actually thinking about this when I was preparing this presentation, which is not in compliance. We just got an email about that today. One example that I had a student who was deaf in one of my classes. And that was the first time I had that experience. And I play a lot of videos in the class. But in general, so when it was first day of class, when she came and told me, she can understand lips and movement. But I specifically asked, what can I do, to ensure that you're learning. And so I had to go ask because I didn't really know what to do. So I asked you, what is helpful for you for me to better, effectively communicate.
Yeah, I've done the same with my students. I actually have an autistic student in one of my classes right now as well that I teach synchronously. And we just talked about it, the best ways that we can facilitate learning in our synchronous course.
Yeah, and I think, and that's open communication is always the key, whether it's in a work, not all workplaces or bosses or CEOs are, maybe they'll say open communication is great, but it doesn't actually happen. But from a faculty or teacher standpoint, I would say that, teachers want to help in any way possible. So definitely let them know.
Yeah. Catherine said, as it relates to building community, students are zoomed out, but Zoom and other virtual communication tools are all we have. What are other ways to build community virtually in these zoomed out moments?
Yeah, so it's funny. Do you think any of your students or coworkers have been Facebooked out or Snapchatted out? So it doesn't, just because we're doing something a lot doesn't mean that's what makes us zoomed out. So again, I would go back to, this is with students or coworkers?
This is students.
Students. Okay, so yeah, those small groups are those helped a lot, the breakout groups, and having them, students, just even if they weren't talking about what they were supposed to be talking about they still were able to have those conversations of whatever they were about. And so I think breakout groups are really important. And there would be times I would just have them work in their group, for 30 minutes of the class. And then we were going to talk about what they talked about, the next class. But it's because I trusted them. And if I don't think any of them signed off, but if they did, whatever, is their prerogative. But I think the breakout groups are a nice small group way for students to interact. And again, even if half it's about what they're supposed to be talking about, and just the other half, they're literally just communicating, for sanity.
Yeah. The other things I will suggest, you can see when you put them in breakout rooms, you can watch them like that.
Yeah, you can.
And the other thing I'll suggest too is if you kind of want to help with the zoomed out, place them in the same groups every single time so they can start building those small group relationships. That way it kind of gives consistency. That's what I'm finding in mine too. And
I know we are at 5 o'clock, so if people want to jump off, I won't be offended whatsoever. But I should have put my contact information up there. But if you have any questions, thoughts, share anything, I'm happy to schedule a Zoom call, or a phone call. It works nicely as well. So.
We have about, I think, 5 more questions. So okay. I think the plan is for 5:15 is the goal.
Oh, was it? Oh, yeah. Good thing I knew the schedule. Okay. So see, we're golden.
Yeah, we should be okay. So Zoe asked, do you have any tips, best practices for collaborating asynchronously while remote? And that's her first question. And then the second question, and I'll bring it back up, but I just want you to know this here. Another question along with that, once you work asynchronously, do you have any tips on how to have the most productive meeting to go through with the asynchronous work?
Yeah. So the first one was collaborating asynchronously, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So right now I'm teaching asynchronously, and I have group projects, and they sign a contract of and basically talk about how they're going to communicate effectively. And what I've seen work most effectively with students is when they decide to do a video call. But students will also there's a GroupMe app. And so it's like a texting app where you don't have each other's phone numbers even, but it's just it's called GroupMe. So students will communicate that way. But again, I think it all goes back to what their preferred mode of communication is. But the students that always do the best are the ones that end up meeting, have a web call, because again, that goes back to the kind of engagement and accountability. So if I'm having a group meeting with Dr. Willett and Han, and we have a group project, well, I know them pretty well, so let's pretend they're strangers. If it's just if you see them in person, you have a different level of commitment and relationship, and the same thing with on camera. So I think you are more engaged, and so I think encouraging them to do that, of course, on their own time, it's asynchronous, but then also making sure they're communicating in some other way if they can't all get together on a virtual or on a call. And then recording those meetings is also important too, for, let's say, this person that's in Hong Kong and the other people are in South Dakota and California, so different time zones. So record the meeting so then that group member doesn't feel left out or doesn't have to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning.
So I think you answered the second question, but that was once you work asynchronously, do you have any tips on how to have the most productive meeting to go through the asynchronous work, which I think was the second part.
And another thing to note, have a note taker, have someone take notes and send a follow-up email after the meeting's over. And again, that goes back to accountability and just even remembering whose role, who's doing what and what's their role and the timeline of things. So I think a note taker is as old as it sounds, it's effective.
Okay. So this one kind of got upvoted, so I'm going to bring this one up. Okay. Thomas asked, where I work, when a good video was produced, it became something people wanted to have simply because it was the new cool thing, when a video is not always the best communication tool. This is starting to happen now with video meetings. Any advice on breaking down when a regular phone meeting is a good option instead of a video meeting?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And that's what I love about working with Dr. Han and Dr. Willett. We'll, just be on chat and they say do you want to Zoom or do you want to do a phone call? But yeah, there are plenty of things that a good old fashioned, phone meeting will do. When visuals are essential, or even, Zoom has an optional to call in. So maybe, you don't, or you can't even be on video, but thinking of what is the purpose of the meeting and does that video help you fulfill that purpose? So but then there's also people that just for, they want to see you. Are you at your desk? Are you actually at your home working? Or so I think, what is the purpose of the meeting? And do you think it can be done effectively without visuals, physically on the screen where you have to share your screen, you're looking at charts and data. But yeah, definitely, I would 100% say mix it up between phone and video calls.
Cisco asks, what are your thoughts on Zoomed networking events?
Yes. So when the pandemic started, I remember attending Zoom happy hours. So, they were with my colleagues. So it's kind of like networking. But of course that started dying down. People were getting Zoomed out. But I think it's important, and especially for someone that started a new job during a pandemic that hasn't gotten to meet many of my colleagues. I think that having those, is nice. So we've had a couple different coffee chats with people that are on the 6th floor. And it's I know it's nice for me because I haven't gotten to meet them. So I think that's helpful. And I know that Dr. Will and I and Dr. Han want to do that for our students, because that's what a lot of students, go to grad school. A part of that is networking with, people. And so when you're not in person, how else can you do it? So I think having, and again, what is the purpose? So for us, it's to connect our students. They don't have to be in the same class to be connected, but how can we connect our students and alumni? So I think, again, what is the purpose, and making sure that, they're optional and not too often.
Yeah. Deborah commented regarding student boredom with icebreakers. I have several groups of students I meet with regularly. I assign some students in advance in charge of ambiance. I let them have a pretty long leash in choosing activities or icebreakers. Reverent is okay. So that's a great idea. Thank you, Deborah.
I love that. Thanks for sharing, Deborah.
And then she also shared that autism spectrum disorder represent, Natalie. Me too. Personally, I love the new remote universe. So I think that kind of concludes all of our question and answers. We got done a little bit early. So that's the other nice thing about Zoom. Sometimes that you get done a little early and get a little of your time back.
Yeah.
At least I've found. So if no one else has any questions, and people are now saying thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I will let Dr. Hernandez kind of finish it up though. So
yeah, I know I had your most valuable asset, which was your time. So I appreciate you showing up. And again, I don't know if there's an email that goes out after, we'll make sure that my contact is in there. But yeah, thanks again, and have a great rest of your evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Take care.
Bye, everybody.